everyone. Thank you, Patricia, and thank you everyone for being here today. It's an honor and a pleasure to be speaking to you. In the exhibition Expedition, Fashion from the Extreme, the curators have done a spectacular job demonstrating the marriage of functional clothing for different environments with high fashion from some of the most famous designers of the last century. Since we're talking about the marriage of fashion and function, I thought I would open with a photograph that literally encapsulates this marriage, which you saw this morning in Patricia's talk already, which is the 1947 Irving Penn portrait of the Danish-American couple Dagmar and Peter Freuchen. Dagmar, who was born Dagmar Kohn, was a prolific fashion illustrator whose work appeared in Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, including this April 1947 Vogue cover, showcasing Christian Dior's new look, straight from Paris. Dagmar's husband was a polar explorer, which you may have picked up on, but not just any polar explorer. Peter Freuchen was a man famed for covering thousands of miles of polar terrain by dog sled, who lived amongst native peoples in Greenland and became a passionate advocate for them, who once amputated his own frostbitten foot after quite literally clawing himself out of a blizzard. One of the things I love about this photo is how Peter Freuchen, as a career explorer, chose to present himself to a wide audience, next to his stylish wife, yes, but also standing at his full height of 6 feet 7 inches, with a courageous look and confident pose, wrapped in an immense coat made of polar bear fur. Some even say it was a bear he killed himself. He certainly cuts a dashing figure. But whether or not, like Freuchen, they've posed for one of the great fashion photographers, polar explorers, like explorers in other parts of the world, have always been conscious of image and self-presentation. Exploratory journeys might be the stuff of legends, but they were usually fueled not only by scientific curiosity or a spirit of adventure, but also by something much more mundane: money. Explorers needed to fundraise to buy the supplies they needed, and once they returned, they made money by writing books about their exploits, giving paid lectures, and by the 20th century, licensing photographs of themselves taken in the field and collaborating with corporate sponsors. In order to sell themselves as credible explorers, they needed to look the part. Of course, warm protective clothing is essential in polar environments. But when we start peeling back the historical layers, we find that self-fashioning, and not just function, has always been part of dressing for the polar regions. And when we talk about dressing for the extremely cold and windy conditions of the Arctic and Antarctica, layers are more than just metaphorical. Native Arctic peoples, from northern Scandinavia to Siberia to modern-day Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, have over many centuries perfected ways of making and wearing clothing using locally available materials and layering different pieces of fur and skin clothing, including hooded parkas, pants, and footwear, to trap pockets of air between the layers. These pockets of air are then warmed by heat that the body gives off, creating warmth and insulation for the wearer. Fur and skin garments could be topped with an outer parka made of specially prepared animal membranes, like seal intestines, to provide a waterproof layer that was especially useful for hunting at sea. Traditionally, all of these layers were designed so that they could easily be moved or removed to keep the body from getting too warm. This feature is crucial since in very cold Arctic conditions, sweat can freeze instantly, potentially creating layers of ice against the skin and diminishing the insulating effects of clothing. These are just some of the many ingenious technical features of traditional Arctic clothing. But while indigenous Arctic garments are highly sophisticated survival technologies, they're more than just functional. Clothing made from animals is a material link between humans and the creatures that keep humans alive, reflecting native Arctic beliefs about the interconnectedness of humans and other forms of life on this planet. In many Inuit communities in North America, carefully making and valuing clothing is still seen as a way that humans can show respect for the animals that gave them the materials for clothes, as well as giving them meat for food and bones and ivory to create tools and artwork. Also, the broad category of native Arctic clothing encompasses many different regional looks and stylistic changes over time. Intricate designs can be created through the skillful manipulation of fur with different colors, patterns, and lusters, but native Arctic peoples also have a long tradition of creatively incorporating imported materials into their ways of dressing, including cotton and wool textiles, beads, ribbons, rickrack, and other trims brought north by outsiders, including explorers, as can be seen in this photo from a Hudson's Bay Company publication in the 1940s. From its original incarnation in centuries-old indigenous traditions, polar dressing has always been not just about survival, but also about personal creativity, demonstration of sewing and fabrication skills, regional and cultural belonging, and an expression of the human place in the greater universe. Now, outsider interest in the Arctic, especially European interest, goes back centuries. As Lacey mentioned this morning, Pythias the Greek described his northern sojourns in the 3rd century BC. But European exploration of the Arctic really grew dramatically beginning in the 2nd and 3rd decades of the 19th century. Great Britain was especially active under the tenure of Sir John Barrow, 2nd Secretary of the Admiralty from 1804 to 1845, who was passionate about geographic exploration and organized numerous government-backed expeditions to the Canadian Arctic. Some people say that it was because Britain had beefed up its navy during the Napoleonic Wars, and then once the wars were over, they needed something to do with all these extra sailors and ships and infrastructure that they'd assembled, so they figured they would send them off to look for the Northwest Passage and to conduct other kinds of geographic exploration. Because most of these British expeditions were officially Navy expeditions, they set out equipped with military-issue wool, leather, and cotton clothing. Here, we see an image from the official published account, of an expedition under the leadership of Sir James Clark Ross from 1818 to 1819 to the Canadian Arctic. This image depicts sailors from Ross's ships, who can be easily distinguished by their blue and wool coats, and in the front especially here by their bicorn hats, although this guy in the back has a top hat too, which is pretty distinctive here. They're depicted here meeting Inuit men at Prince Regent's Bay in northwest Greenland. This image was drawn by John Satchus, whose name is sometimes given as John Sackhouse, who was an Inuit man from Greenland who served on Ross's expedition and acted as a translator, and also was quite an artist as well. In making this drawing, he keenly observed the dress of both the local men and of the British sailors, the latter of which stands out dramatically against the mostly white landscape. But it was not long before European and American explorers began to adopt at least some elements of indigenous Arctic clothing, recognizing the superior warmth and insulating properties of fur and the sophistication of Inuit construction techniques. As the historian Barbara Schwager has pointed out, by the mid-19th century, many British explorers and their crews began to trade for clothing with Inuit they encountered, or to commission Inuit women to make clothes for them, even as they often retained British dress for Sunday religious services on the ships or when posing for official portraits, as a way of keeping up appearances even in brutally cold, windy conditions. Others, especially American explorers like Elisha Kent Kane here on the left, wholeheartedly embraced wearing fur clothing. They recognized that not only would wearing fur serve them well on expeditions, but that posing in furs might seem exotic and exciting to American audiences who would buy accounts of their journeys and pay to see them give lectures. Perhaps Americans had more of a taste for such images than the British, especially urban Americans, who by the mid-19th century were eagerly consuming books and art depicting the American western frontier and the rugged mountain men and fur trappers there who similarly embraced indigenous clothing, like the buckskin pants and shirts commonly worn by Plains Indians. Perhaps the Arctic, to Americans, seemed like a new frontier, just up north instead of out west. It's clear, though, that explorers of all stripes navigated wearing traditional Arctic or traditional Western garments at a very personal level. For example, in 2015, a team of underwater archaeologists began to systematically excavate the wreck of the HMS Erebus, one of the two ships that were part of the famous expedition of Sir John Franklin, who seemingly disappeared in the Canadian Arctic after 1845. The Erebus was located by archaeologists in 2014, south of King William Island. Among other objects they recovered from the wreck, the archaeologists found a Western-style leather slipper that had been lined with sealskin, over here. One man's seemingly improvised adaptation during the course of the expedition to the Arctic environment. The slipper is currently on display at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich as part of an exhibit about the Franklin expedition, and I've heard that it's going to travel to the US, so you may have a chance to see this truly extraordinary object in person. Now, the early to mid-19th century was not only a time of increased exploratory activity in the Arctic, as in other parts of the globe, but also the height of the Arctic whaling industry. American and European whaling vessels came to the far north on the heels of the explorers to secure oil and whalebone for the global market. While they had different goals than the explorers, the Arctic whalers also had to figure out how to dress for polar conditions. Many crews eagerly adopted fur ensembles to see them through the multiple long winters they might spend in the Arctic, waiting for the sea ice to melt every summer so that they could hunt whales. George Comer, who you can see in the back center in this crew photograph from 1904 towards the end of his career, was a prolific whaling captain based out of New London, Connecticut. He and his crew, here clad all in fur, lived intimately among Inuit communities on the shore of Hudson Bay, commissioning Inuit women to make fur clothing for them while hiring their husbands, who were skilled whale hunters themselves, to assist with the pursuit and processing of the whales. Perhaps because they were not concerned with public image in the same way that explorers were, these whalers may have had fewer reservations about fully embracing fur clothing. Explorers, on the other hand, continued to reckon with balancing function in the field with public image when it came to clothes, especially by the turn of the 20th century, when public interest in polar exploration reached a fever pitch, as Lacey mentioned this morning. Interest in exploring Antarctica had grown in intensity since the early 1890s, and the world eagerly waited to see who would be the first individuals to reach the North Pole and the South Pole, considered by many to be among the last great prizes for explorers. By this time, photography had become an integral part of exploration, and photographs of explorers dressed up in their field kit were widely disseminated to create interest in these Arctic and Antarctic expeditions. Some explorers, like Brooklyn native Frederick Cook on the right, lived in Bushwick, posed in Inuit-made fur clothing, continuing to play to American fascination with frontiers and rugged frontiersmen who seemed to flirt with going native while still retaining the trappings of urban, educated white men. Other explorers, like Robert Falcon Scott on the left, relied mostly on wool and cotton clothing, while using fur mainly for mittens, boots, and sleeping bags. Scott's last expedition to Antarctica from 1910 to 1912, which he just failed to beat out Roald Amundsen to the South Pole, as we heard this morning, was one of the most heavily photographed of this era. His expedition team included professional photographer Herbert Ponting, and the hundreds of images Ponting took in Antarctica of Scott's crew, as well as the landscape and wildlife, helped shape the image of Robert Falcon Scott, as well as Antarctic exploration in general for the next century. It's worth mentioning that one of Ponting's tasks on this expedition, specially requested by Scott, was to take pictures of the men to send back to the companies that had provided the gear, including clothes, for the expedition. By this point in time, clothing and textile manufacturers recognized the value of sponsoring explorers. Explorers were celebrities, and companies like Jaeger and Burberry eagerly featured the names and images of explorers who used their gear in advertisements. Being able to connect their products to these famous figures meant good publicity for the manufacturers and conveyed a sense that the products were well made and durable under any conditions. In exchange for this publicity, explorers were typically able to command products from these companies at steep discounts, or sometimes for free. So, whether they embraced Inuit-style fur garments or kept up Western styles of dressing in the field, polar explorers weighed considerations of style, function, and publicity when choosing how to dress. Not long after the men of the Charcot expedition, here on the right, sipped Mumm champagne to celebrate Bastille Day in Antarctica, this is a French expedition, global events created a new group of consumers interested in polar clothing. After World War I, several European and North American governments recognized that their preparations for warfare in winter conditions needed drastic improvements. The US military especially invested heavily in research into gear for cold weather combat in the years leading up to and during World War II. This research took on an especially urgent quality during the early Cold War of the late 1940s and early 1950s, when it seemed plausible that the Soviet military might attempt a full-scale invasion of the United States via Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, because at its narrowest point, the Bering Sea that separates those two countries is only several dozen miles wide. Dressing a potential polar army required materials that could effectively insulate the body and trap warm pockets of air against the skin, like fur, but had the lighter weight and flexibility of textiles, as well as the ability to be quickly produced in mass quantities needed for an army. Military research labs, including the Harvard Fatigue Lab, and especially the Arctic Aeromedical Laboratory in Fairbanks, Alaska at Fort Ladd, which is now called Fort Wainwright, experimented with newly developed synthetic textiles and different types of garments in outdoor conditions. Not all of these experiments, like this walk-around sleeping bag, were successful, but the results gathered in the reports of the US Army's Quartermaster Corps made effective winter combat, which had seemed nearly impossible for many armies for centuries, now seem like a possibility with the right gear. As historian Rachel Gross has shown, these military innovations trickled out to consumers in the form of lightweight, warm clothing made of synthetic materials well suited to outdoor recreation like camping, hiking, and skiing. Polar explorers, too, took advantage of this new gear, like the members of the 1958 Commonwealth Trans-Antarctic Expedition, which made the first successful crossing of the entire Antarctic continent. This expedition was also famous for including Sir Edmund Hillary, who's standing here second from the right, who only 5 years earlier had become one of the first two confirmed human beings, along with Tenzing Norgay, to stand on the summit of Mount Everest. Today's polar explorers, like Ben Saunders, continue to make use of the latest innovations in lightweight, insulating clothing made of synthetic performance textiles. But like their predecessors from a century ago, explorers like Saunders also recognize the value of collaborating with corporate sponsors, as you can see here with this image produced for Red Bull's website. In the 21st century, the boundaries of what can be considered polar exploration clothing continue to expand in many interesting directions. There we go. In recent years, NASA and other space programs have used the dry, rocky landscapes found in parts of the Arctic and Antarctica as training grounds in preparation for sending human beings to other planets. The ongoing Houghton Mars project, for example, places fully suited astronauts in the rocky deserts of Devon Island in the Canadian Arctic, to show how astronauts' clothing and other gear fares in an environment that's closer to the harsh conditions of Mars than almost any other place on the planet. At the same time, the names and heroic images of explorers from a century ago are still used as inspiration for designers and to evoke a sense of adventure to sell clothing and other products. Just a few recent examples include the recently launched Shackleton menswear brand, which has the blessing of Lady Alexandra Shackleton, granddaughter of the famed explorer Ernest Shackleton. Or we have replicas of early 20th century maritime and polar garb sold in the gift shop, in this case of the Gränna Museum in Sweden, although this is not the only museum that's done tie-in products like this. This is a museum that happens to interpret the story of the noted Swedish polar explorer Salomon August André. Occasionally, polar explorers are also used to market skincare products too. This whole brand is inspired by Roald Amundsen. It's a Norwegian company, and this is just a feature from Birchbox's website showcasing some different products. But contemporary polar dressing also includes the work of up-and-coming Inuit designers. Designers like Nicole Kampuag, Victoria Kakuktinik, and others give their own interpretations of traditional indigenous clothing forms like parkas, and work with combinations of traditional and contemporary materials and patterns. Their work not only speaks to their own creativity as designers, but also demonstrates the ability of indigenous designed fashion to resist inappropriate appropriations of native clothing and patterns by Western designers. It also shows how materials like sealskin and other furs, considered unequivocally cruel by some Western consumers, continue to be integral to Inuit culture. These designers speak the language of mainstream fashion, but in a uniquely indigenous way, that shows that tradition doesn't have to mean something static and frozen in the past, but is dynamic and constantly evolving. Showing the dynamism of contemporary Inuit dress and using clothing to challenge stereotypes was the inspiration for Joey Flowers, an Inuit lawyer from Nunavut, Canada, to create his Tumblr, Folks Dressed Up Like Eskimos. The title is a play on the lyrics of the Christmas song made famous by Nat King Cole. Flowers' posts feature his native friends, family members, and strangers who submitted photos of themselves in their favorite outfits. In an interview with Nunatisiak online in 2012, Flowers said of the photos he received, quote, "I think it's very telling that Inuit present themselves as living in many different realities. We are on the land, we are in cities, we are at the gym, we are hunters, we are university lecturers, we are jokers, we are athletes, we are prom queens, we are artists, we are motorcyclists. Our identity as individuals and as a collective is as diverse and complex as that of any other people. I have made it very difficult to picture one type of Eskimo in the line, folks dressed up like Eskimos. And indeed, in the center photo here, you can see Flowers, who is wearing his McGill Law School sweatshirt, pointedly posing in front of a display of older style parkas and fur pants in a museum. I think he's making an incredible statement there. So to conclude, we've seen that when it comes to clothing, layering is a critical technique for staying warm in polar environments. Layering also describes cultural attitudes and adaptations that have become layered on top of each other over the course of history. But where do we go from here? What will happen to polar clothing as the Arctic and Antarctic regions continue to warm and melt under the effects of climate change? Will we need to eventually abandon these kinds of garments in favor of what scholars Delia Hanna and Cynthia Seelan have called seasonless fashion? Or will the enduring appeal of polar environments and polar history continue to influence fashion design even as the glaciers and sea ice thaw and disappear? Thank you.